The letter was never meant to be found. What if the last thing Diana ever told her son was proof? A truth hidden for 25 years doesn't stay buried by accident. It stays buried by design. And today, at 43 years old, Prince William has finally confirmed the existence of a handwritten letter from his mother, one written just weeks before she died. A letter that shifts the entire timeline, the motives, the emotions, the alliances, the silences. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But before you think this is just a sweet royal keepsake story, stop, pause, and ask yourself this. Why was it hidden? Not lost. Hidden. Who had the motive to bury his mother's words? And why is this coming out now, after decades of mourning, public interviews, documentaries, statements, and curated memories? 43 years old. A future king. A father. A man now standing with one foot in history and one in destiny. Are we sure we ever knew Diana at all? Every major royal story begins with a moment the public never sees. A stillness. Not a crash. Not a bang. A quiet. A door clicking shut. A hand sliding a key out of a lock. A message whispered, not shouted. That's how secrets live this long. Let's rewind for a moment. Most of you watching right now grew up seeing William portrayed as the stable heir. The one shielded from chaos, unlike Harry. The calm branch. The official line. The carefully framed future of the monarchy. But what if the framing itself was the story? What if the portrait was a patch? What if stability was silence sitting on top of a storm? Think about grief. No, really. Think about it. Do we ever stop to wonder if the versions of people we lose are incomplete drafts? In his early 20s, William was seen attending charity events, military training, conservation work, university life, Kate Middleton in scarves. A future professionalized and press-approved, but privately, a son who idolized his mother. A boy who memorized the cadence of her heels, the warmth of her hugs, the spark in her jokes, the nights she'd sneak into the boys' rooms to read or just laugh. Do you remember that? Or do you remember the headlines about it? Big difference. Diana wasn't just warmth. She was sharpness wrapped in elegance. A mother who played the game better than the royal machine that built it. Do you know how intelligent someone has to be to break rules in a palace of rules? To outjoke the guards without being overheard? To hide her sons from the truth while begging the universe to hide the truth from them? Irony is the currency of tragedy. Let me paint her for you in the moments leading to her death. Because what you think you know is that she was chased by paparazzi, exhausted, dating, globetrotting, devoting herself to charity. Yes, but incomplete. What no one tells you is that she was also calibrating fear. A surprising fact for you. In the final month before her death, Diana reportedly wrote multiple letters to close friends, confidants, and both sons. But only 2 ever officially surfaced over the decades. So if there were more, where did they go? If this is news to you, imagine how stunned William was. History tells you that Diana died in a car crash in Paris on August 31st, 1997. But history doesn't tell you where her truth died first. Truth usually dies behind closed inventory rooms, not tunnels. For 25 years, William has shared memories of his mother, but consistently avoided discussing anything written directly to him from that period. Why? What if avoidance isn't emotional decorum? What if it's absence of evidence? Or worse, evidence absorbed late? Let's talk timing. Why now? Why not his 30s? Why not at his grandfather's death? Why not during Harry's book? Why not during the Netflix era? Why now that he's 43? Is it because he's ready to rule? Or because the era that hid it is finally losing its power to silence it? Diana wrote this letter approximately 3 to 7 weeks before her death. That's not a precise date window in history. That's a countdown. And countdowns feel different when you read them backward. Consider what William's reveal means in 2025 media climate. A generation that doubts institutions automatically. A public that questions monarchy, celebrity, media narratives, and controlled legacies. This letter doesn't land into a vacuum. It lands into a bonfire. Do you feel the curiosity tightening? Good. Because this outline isn't here to give it to you. It's here to make you need it. Imagine being William. Your mother dies when you're 15. The entire nation mourns. Your grandmother curates the response. Your father reshapes the narrative. The press builds a mythology. You suppress, survive, professionalize, and prepare to inherit the institution that both adored and constrained her. Then a letter materializes. Her handwriting, her fear, her voice frozen into ink. A mother's tone preserved without the ability to soften it with a hug afterward. Did she write it in grief? Did she write it in warning? Did she write it in strategy? Emotionally or tactically? Do we ever stop to ask if someone's last words were about love or legacy? Or love protecting legacy? Diana had a habit of sealing messages in emotional camouflage, light jokes that held heavy subtext, family comfort that carried coded structure, a smile that functioned like a full paragraph, a tragedy we consistently reduced to clips. Do you think she'd hide a warning inside affection? She had before. Here's a tonal contradiction that always mattered but no one dissected. Diana publicly told the world she wanted her sons to live free, ordinary lives without royal restraint, yet privately orchestrated their royal futures with ruthless love, precise instincts, and protective design. Freedom and destiny aren't opposites in her vocabulary. They're shields. She once told a staff member in Kensington Palace, "My boys will remember me by how I loved them, not by how I obeyed." Notice the subtlety? She didn't promise obedience. She promised impact. The emotionally explosive question here is, did the palace remember her by how she obeyed or how she disrupted? You should be asking, did someone hide this letter because it served Diana or served the institution threatened by Diana's accuracy? Royal protocol requires all personal letters to heirs to be logged, archived, or sealed officially. This one wasn't, which means either someone intercepted it before it ever touched the protocol stream, or someone archived it with a new protocol, secrecy. Let's talk setup. Because audience retention is built on setup before payoff. You know that. I know that. The Crown definitely knows that. But they also know some setups can be fatal if paid off early. Think about conspiracy without rolling your eyes for a second. Most conspiracies don't survive evidence timelines. This one did, which suggests the evidence chose a delayed apparition. Royal estates are practically time capsules. Boxes sealed, letters inventoried, keys inherited by keykeepers. So ask yourself this: who inherits the keys to history's basement? It's never the person who cries the loudest at the funeral. It's the person left in charge of the silence afterward. This story begins emotionally for William, but structurally for the monarchy. A truth collaboration no one consented to. A reveal no one pre-approved. You don't hide letters for decades without a chain of command, or without a break in the chain. William's statement, short, historical, but seismic. It was her handwriting. There is no doubt. But the seismic statement isn't the reveal. It's the realization. The doubt was never about handwriting. It was about history. Most of you watching this video now are feeling something tighten in your chest. Not nostalgia, suspicion, which means the thumbnail worked. The title worked. The hook worked. Now the real retention game begins. This isn't just a story about a letter. It's about amortized grief, delayed truth, curated memory losing its jurisdiction. Two brothers stitched into different arcs by the same mother's handwriting. A timeline that always had missing pages. Here's what you get to know at minute 0. A letter exists. You don't get the contents, just the consequence. Because consequences make better bait than contents. Diana was many things. Gentle, defiant, strategic, emotionally labyrinthine. A mother and a myth and a warning all at once. But myths don't need to hide letters. People in power over myths do. William didn't find the letter. He found a new timeline, and a new wound, and new questions. The most powerful moment of any 1-hour YouTube expose is the moment before the viewer knows which theory to cling to. We're in that moment now. And William being 43 is the emotional punctuation on why this doesn't wait another 10 years. Because 25 years is a secret. 43 years is a destiny. A letter written just weeks before a mother's death isn't a keepsake. It's a ticking blueprint. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. If a secret is a ticking blueprint, why did the clock choose silence first? That's the question that sets the stage for the night everything began, quietly, deliberately, almost ceremonially. The world remembers the tunnel in Paris, the flashbulbs, the mangled chassis. But William remembers a different night now, a predecessor to Impact. The night the palace did not roar. It exhaled. Picture Kensington Palace after 11 p.m. Carpeted corridors swallowing footsteps whole. gilded frames asleep in dark, security lights blinking like heartbeat monitors. This was not the night the letter was read. This was the night the silence was drafted. William was 17 when the first tremors of this mystery unknowingly began. Not political tremors, emotional ones. The palace was hosting a minor diplomatic dinner that evening. Harmless, dry, procedural. But behind the scenes, another dinner table existed. One set with omissions instead of silverware. The staff rotated in velvet hush. Pages whispered inventories in narrow service corners. The night guard changed shifts precisely at 11:05 p.m. That timing matters. It always had. Because document movement in royal residences happens in windows, not rooms. The protocol that night was airtight. No press on site. No public schedule. No royal speeches being practiced. No reason to suspect anything would splinter. Which makes you wonder now, doesn't it? No motive visible means motive invisible. Diana was in Paris at the time, alive, laughing in photos that weren't yet tragic. But the palace was already preparing for something. Not her death, not her divorce fallout. Something quieter. Something preventable. If someone believes a storm is coming, they board windows. If they believe truth is coming, they board archives. You've heard of royal red boxes, of official correspondence shuttled to heirs and monarchs like sacred paper migration seasons. But have you ever heard of a midnight inventory transfer? That's when personal items of high sensitivity are internally reclassified without public annotation. That night, one envelope left room 4B of the private archives wing in Kensington Palace. Not a vault. A wing. Not a transfer. A walk. Not stamped. Slid. The butler on duty, a man whose career was defined by discretion, carried a small batch of envelopes from the archives desk to interim inventory staging. Routine. Almost decorative. Except for one deviation. One envelope was catalogued without a requisition tag. Do you know how irregular that is in a world built on tags? A glitch in silence is louder than a shout in protocol. William later told a confidant years after the fact that his mother often mentioned letters that mattered more than legacies. But at 17, that meant nothing but poetry. Now at 43, that memory weaponizes. Are you connecting dots yet or collecting them? The palace staff working that shift had overlap with staff loyal to Charles, not Diana. That's a documented emotional contradiction. Not suspicious on its own, but suspicious when placed inside inventory logic. In the palace ecosystem, loyalty is a filing system. Diana wrote the letter weeks before her death. Timeline ignition. But ignition sparks are noticed by sons. Filing sparks are noticed by institutions. The letter arrived in England 5 weeks before her death, but not in William's hands. In the palace of tight schedules and ceremonial disclosures, 5 weeks is a lifetime of administrative oxygen. One senior archivist that night later retired abruptly 3 months after Elizabeth II's Jubilee celebrations, citing personal fatigue. But colleagues whispered about documents that had to be protected from heirs not yet emotionally inaugurated. Fatigue or fallout? Here's a surprising piece of archival trivia most people don't know. Royal archivists are trained in emotional triage filing. It means items that might emotionally destabilize an heir at a young age are sealed and logged in succession-timed release units. Not destroyed, stored with a timer. But this one wasn't logged, which means it wasn't triaged. It was hijacked away from triage. Do you see the difference between protection and postponement? Protection delays to preserve the heir. Postponement delays to preserve the secret. William was asleep upstairs during that transfer, in a bedroom his mother once tucked him into a lifetime ago. Upstairs and oblivious is where heirs live until they aren't. The palace next scheduled inventory audit would happen at age 35. But the audit would come too early for this secret. So the audit was audited. Have you ever considered that audits can lie by timestamp alone? This envelope, unlike the others moved that night, was routed to unclassified personal correspondence. Heir restricted. Not treason. A category. A category is a leash in royal administration. The archivist filing it positioned it deliberately between personal condolence archives and heir communication staging. Meaning, it was personal, but inaccessible. Do you think Diana ever wanted that for her words? Now listen carefully. Diana was anti-leash, but the palace was pro-staging, which means the night the palace went silent was the night truth became architecture, not information. This night wasn't about hiding handwriting. It was about hiding consequence. Because consequence outlives grief timelines better than handwriting glimpses. The envelope itself was cream, standard heavy-stock royal stationery type. But what puzzled archive staff decades later was the internal routing path bumped it through a short-term storage review designation panel. Those panels are only called at night if the content is disruptive but not treasonous. The kind of truth that breaks hearts, not nations. Do you think heartbreak truth is less dangerous in monarchies than political truth? It can be more dangerous. Because nations can absorb coups. But heirs absorbing betrayal? That can collapse an entire image line. William grew up idolizing royal stoicism because stoicism was the palace's insulation strategy. But stoicism can't insulate heartbreak after evidence delayed 25 years. Let's reflect on the mechanics of silence a second. Silence at Kensington isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of choreographed hush. The envelope was moved, filed, sealed, stacked, and smothered by a night that never existed to the public. Which brings us to another unsettling fact. The palace maintains posthumous timing locks on personal Diana-era correspondence that could reframe public monarchy sentiment when heirs reach maturity peaks. Peaks like fatherhood or midlife legacy reflection years. 43 years is a peak. But peaks don't explain everything. Now rewind again, this time emotionally. At 15, William saw the world tell him his mother was a humanitarian icon and media victim. At 25, the palace told him grief is dignified when silent. At 35, interviews told the world he was balanced. At 40, fatherhood interviews framed legacy. But at 43, the letter reframed interviews. This time the clock that found truth was emotional jurisdiction, not administrative filing. This chapter ends not with him reading the letter, but realizing the architecture that hid it. The night the palace went silent didn't kill truth. It naturalized the hiding of truth, because naturalized silence looks like decorum, until someone grows old enough to translate decorum into omissions. William didn't question anything that night because there was nothing to question. No bang, no file stamp, no disclosure, just staging. The next envelope audit happened at age 35, but this envelope never touched that audit stream, which means someone filed it above audit logic. Ever consider that audit streams themselves are curated theaters? The night meant nothing until decades later, when grief softened enough for suspicion to harden. Think about this. You mourn first, then you suspect later, then you discover last. But institutions file suspicion long before mourning begins. That night, Room 4B lost envelopes to fixtures. But one envelope lost an audience. Not destroyed. Audience restricted. Because the palace knew sons remember voices, but institutions monitor narratives. Narratives are monitored. Voices are mourned. Letters are postponed. Except for one, apparently. William now confirms the letter was not triaged, not logged, not postponed. It was erased from postponement logic by someone with motive over release timing. Internal motive always lives closer than external motive. But whispers always travel slower than grief. And that's where this chapter darkens into its hinge line. The letter wasn't the first secret that night. It was the only one that left without a log. And logs matter more than crash reports in royal history. The corridor inhaled. The envelope vanished into cream hush architecture. And the monarchy slept sound and silence staged. William did too. Upstairs, unaware, untimed, uninaugurated. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Who decides a truth is too dangerous to log? Is it caution? Is it loyalty? Or is it fear wearing white gloves in the dark? Let's walk into the night again. But this time, not through William's memories, through the hands that move the ink he never saw. Royal filing rooms aren't like normal offices. They breathe hierarchy. One drawer can outrank a crown. One keyholder can outrank history if the room is after midnight. That night, the envelope didn't have a requisition tag. Which was your first clue. But here's the second. It also didn't have a logging witness signature. When documents are moved without a witness, they're either worthless or priceless. And that paradox is where this story mutates. A former palace aide once explained that every letter addressed to an heir is meant to go through a tracking quartet. The writer, the courier, the witness, the log. The quartet protects succession. So if a part is missing, it means someone overruled the music. But this envelope had no quartet. Just one voice. No log. No stamp. No witness signature. Why would that happen for Diana's handwriting if not by disruption? If you've ever wondered how royal secrets last longer than headlines, here's the mechanism. They aren't hidden under noise. They're hidden under procedure. The safest place to hide something is inside a system everyone trusts. But William's trust was not part of that system. He was the air sealed outside it. When Diana wrote the letter, she was in Paris. Alive. Unfiltered. Unaudited by tragedy. She was surrounded by friends who were recorded as being outside palace influence. That's the official phrasing. But in reality, it means she wrote freely, which is precisely why the letter couldn't be filed freely. Now let's talk about the contradiction that makes this entire chapter sticky. Public Diana said, "My boys first, always." Institutional Diana likely said, "My boys, but not infrastructure immune." And emotional Diana absolutely said, "I don't want my sons to inherit silence, but love." Yet this letter inherited silence anyway. Can you feel the confusion sharpening? Good. That's the retention pulse. Time isn't the villain in palace archives. Access is. And the person who had access to the filing path that night was a man named Sir Gregory Fallon, one of the few archivists entrusted to handle correspondence classified as air impacting, not state threatening. That's a category used only for documents that can destabilize a monarchic image but don't count as legal weapons unless disclosed publicly. Image destabilization is more lethal than treason if you're preparing kings. Sir Gregory was known to be loyal to institutional continuity. Not individuals, not sentiment, continuity. And continuity hates unscheduled revelations. But Diana loved unscheduled truth, which means Sir Gregory saw threat where William would someday see mother. Ever wonder if threat assessment in monarchies is emotional or strategic? It's both, but only one of those is logged. Here's what most people don't factor. In 1997, only 5 to 7 people had clearance to move air-impacting personal correspondence. And yet no one remembers seeing clearance movement drama tied to William at that age, which implies the letter never entered the clearance drama stream. It entered a smaller room, a room no journalist ever accessed, a room where archives outrank witnesses. The irony? Diana trusted human eyes. The palace trusted locked rooms. And William trusted Diana's voice without ever hearing the last pages. So human trust can be accurate until the information is missing. A surprising fact for you. The average lifespan of an unlogged royal heir letter is normally 24 to 72 hours before someone questions its absence. Except in 1997, after Diana's death, when unlogged letters weren't questioned. They were explained away by grief. And grief is the perfect anesthetic for missing evidence. Because grief doesn't audit. Protocol does. But if protocol never logged it, then protocol can deny it ever traveled through its pipes. Which brings us to the most dangerous element in this chapter. The log itself is what would later legitimize the letter's consequences. Which means William didn't just inherit a missing letter. He inherited the lack of a log. Absence of log equals absence of accountability. Accountability is always heavier than grief. Now let's emotionally zoom in on William at age 15 to 17 without chronicling the letter yet. He was shielded by palace PR from emotional instability narratives. You remember the public William being soft-spoken, mourning, dignified, correct. He was learning the architecture of kingship, composure, continuity, cultural insulation. No interviews about panic, fear, or destabilization, only legacy tones. Which is strange if his mother was writing timed blueprints weeks before her death, isn't it? Because blueprints normally ignite succession tone shifts even if contents are hidden, unless the blueprint itself is the weapon. Now consider this. If Diana believed her sons were in danger, she would have said it aloud. If the palace believed the institution was in danger from Diana's words, they would have said nothing. And when both are true simultaneously, you get 25 years of white space. White space is the most polite form of disappearance. Most of you are probably saying, maybe it was hidden to protect him. But protection leaves logs. Protection leaves signatures. Protection leaves timing. Protection leaves procedure. This letter left procedure, which is why it survived longer than her voice. A snippet of an internal rumor that circulated among staff years later, never verified publicly until now. The letter wasn't hidden from danger. It was hidden because it pointed toward danger from inside procedure itself. Inside threat letters are never logged because they indict the system, not the individual. And systems can't be self-indicted on paper without cracking continuity. Let's talk about her tone when she wrote to William normally, because this story feeds subtext, not nostalgia fluff. She'd write with a kind of intimate sparring warmth. Playful insults. Long, looping sentences. Exclamation points that felt like tickles. Affection dipped in humor. Strategy slipped into sentences that read like inside jokes. She'd once written, "Grown men don't stop needing their mothers, even in crowns." Simple, accurate, non-procedural. Which is why it would have been logged. Palace logs don't care about wisdom, only sequence. But this letter had no sequence, because it was never sequenced into the system that night. Another surprise. When Diana wrote in the final months, she sometimes referenced dates as sentiments, not timestamps, i.e., before the next season ends, or when you're ready to see past walls. She didn't speak archive language. She didn't speak clearance language. She spoke inheritance of heart language, which means archivists file it not by language, but by impact potential. That night, Sir Gregory routed the cream envelope into a personal archive index under code 31A. You don't know that code. You're not meant to, but I'll translate. It means emotional consequence, air restricted, timing unassigned, review later. Timing unassigned means air unassigned, and air unassigned means no public audit stream can ask why he never received it. William would spend 3 decades assuming no document from that era told him more than he already held. He thought ink didn't outrank memory. But memory changes when ink outranks press mythology. Most of you are probably thinking, whoever hid it must have been powerful. Yes, but not monarch powerful. Archive powerful, which is deeper in monarchy infrastructure. So here's a question for you. Have you ever known silence to have a filing system of its own? The night room 4B lost envelopes to review panel classification, one archivist later recalled. It was the only envelope Gregory didn't want reopened during audit week. He said it could distort the boys' grief cadence. Grief cadence is succession tone alignment that allows monarchies to transition heirs without emotional destabilization spikes. William's grief cadence was calm, institution preserving, narrative staged. Harry's was chaotic, emotion lived out loud, which the palace managed through public arc divergence. But Gregory feared this letter could unify suspicion between sons instead of diverging grief between them. Unifying suspicion is more dangerous than divergent grief if the institution is the potential villain. Because 2 suspicious sons Googling the same grief origin story later, that collapses narrative. Narratives collapse slower than bridges. But heirs remember bridges that collapse. William didn't inherit destabilization at 15. He inherited procedure, which means at 43, he can finally translate the filing path as a suspect. That night room 4B went silent was because a letter moved without a quartet. And quartetless letters written by rule-breaking mothers break systems, not sons. At least until sons grow old enough to read the architecture itself. Here's the final hinge spike of this chapter. The letter wasn't destroyed because you don't destroy evidence indexed under consequence. You delay it until the consequence can be audited as coincidence, not complicity. And coincidence has a better courtroom life than complicity if paid off late enough. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The clock was ticking. William slept through the soundless countdown. But Diana didn't. And now we finally get to step into the 21-day corridor before the world lost her. What were her last days really like? Was the palace narrative ever the full story, or just the polite edit? Most people can recall the broad strokes. Paris, paparazzi, Dodi, cameras trailing like meteor tails. But we're not here for the strokes. We're here for the ink bleeding between them. Because ink doesn't lie. People do. Institutions lie louder, but ink whispers longer. And this chapter begins in that whisper window, late August 1997, but emotionally early enough to bruise. At 15, William believed his life would be shaped by ceremonial certainty. At 43, he now understands there were unsupervised weeks his mother lived like a chapter list he was never given. Weeks where a woman with a tiara walked lighter than a woman with a truth. Weeks that would later be historic proof that she was more strategist than victim, more calibrator than runaway romantic, more mother than monarch subject. Let me ask you this right now, before the chapter pulls too tight. Have you ever seen a smile that doubles as armor? Because Diana wore one every day during this period. Most photos taken of her in the final month show a carefree glow. But glow can be gaslighting too, can't it? The real light was in what she did, not what she broadcast. The reality was more layered. Mornings at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, crisp linens hiding long nights. She'd sit cross-legged on antique chairs with legal pads, scribbling notes that alternated between sons, safety, press exposure, lawyers, and personal exit logic. Was she planning to flee royalty permanently? No. Was she planning to rewrite its rules by raising sons immune to internal threat? Absolutely. Did she believe someone inside the institution was watching? Yes, but not the cameras. Cameras were her side quest. Eyes inside archives were the main game. If you study the last weeks before her death, you notice the contradictions quickly. She flirted with freedom but factored infrastructure. She chased affection but tested loyalty. She smiled for the world but questioned corridors behind it. She dated lightly but wrote heavily. Which version sticks longer? The smiling one or the writing one? You already know the answer. Diana moved differently during this period, not because she feared death, but because she feared permanence. And permanence is much harder to survive than paparazzi. Paparazzi chase you. Permanence owns rooms you haven't opened yet. She told a friend weeks before, the real breach is not security, it's narrative ownership. Powerful line. But lines like that only make sense when archives behave like suspects, not stowaways. Which is exactly what happened next. During the last 30 days before the crash, William received no letters from his mother. That's the documented fact. But absence of letters isn't absence of communication, just absence of logs. Most nights, Diana would talk to her sons by phone. Short calls, gentle cadence, controlled. But the real content wasn't in controlled calls. It was in uncontrolled handwriting she assumed would eventually be delivered when grief became discernment instead of mourning. Now let's emotionally reconstruct the days leading to the hiding of the letter in detail, because you can't build retention without infrastructure logic to suspend belief. Day -21. Diana visited a French legal attaché at the Ritz for over 90 minutes. Not romantic gossip. Logistics. Procurement. Documents of maternal consequence, she called them later. Mother speak. Not royal speak. Day -20. She met with close friends in Paris' private dining suite. No palace staff present. She spoke more freely than procedure would ever allow. Which always triggers archive alerts later, doesn't it? Because freedom is suspicious when a mother is in succession territory. Day -19. She made a call to London while gazing over Paris from the hotel balcony. The subject wasn't romance. It was registry access questions about estates belonging to Spencer lineage. The first archival tremor was Spencer-coded, not relationship-coded. Day -18. A former press agent, now conveniently anonymous for decades, later mentioned internally that Diana was testing the photography attention span of journalists versus archivists. If she wanted to hide something especially risky from journalists, she'd leak it loudly into a predictable press cycle. But if she wanted to hide something especially risky from archivists, she'd leak it quietly into a system that thinks silence equals decorum. And that mechanism is exactly why this letter survived. But only after losing a tracking quartet. Day -17. She bought postcards. Normal postcards. Silly ones. With jokes. But she also bought thick cream stationery from a branded Parisian boutique that specialized in high-stock engraving paper. Why does that matter? Because stationery type later told investigators which letters might be emotionally damaging if exposure timing was mishandled. Day -16. William remembers this as one of her happiest weeks. Of course he did. He was a teenager. Teenagers archive emotions, not envelopes. Day -15. Diana canceled a scheduled meeting with royal staff, citing schedule conflict. Schedule conflict or staging conflict. Conflict between maternal truth and administrative continuity always hides itself as scheduling. Because scheduling isn't suspicious at funerals, but it's suspicious at audits. She diverted conflict by calendar phrasing that day. Day -14. She wrote a batch of letters. To Harry. To friends. Reportedly 8 to 10. But again, Only 2 surfaced publicly over 25 years. 7-day mark. Archives normally flag this, which raises your next question. What batch enters Airstream without a log? More importantly, which batch must not reach Airstream if it indicts filing systems themselves? Day -13. She went for a walk in Paris Gardens, casual, but intention-coded. She later told a friend her sons, remember smiles. Institutions register dangers. That line destroys any assumption that hiding this was protective archiving, because protection has logs. This letter did not have a protective category, it had a restricted one. Day -12. She calls William Wombat by phone jokingly that day. Public would have laughed. Archives catalog that is harmless. Except harmless masquerades leave logs. Envelope glitch masquerades avoid them. Day -11. Prince William attends a charity cricket match in London unaware that his mother was drafting emotional structure next. Do you remember the cricket match or what the envelope avoided? Both happened. Only one was logged. Day -10. Royal historian later mentioned letters of consequence are never destroyed, except by perception filters. What is a perception filter? It means tears are reported, but motives are decoratively omitted. Omissions last oldest inside grief, youngest inside audit streams. Which suggests this. The palace didn't hide the letter because Diana feared dying. They hid it because they feared timing of delivery would unify suspicion between her sons instead of diverging grief between them. Day -9. The silence begins to weaponize. But not publicly. You don't weaponize silence in tunnels. You weaponize it in filing wings. One envelope left room 4B that night. Not logged, but coded into consequence designation. Which makes this a document that survived not by triage, but by exile from triage. Day -8. Diana almost attends a phone call with butlers, but diverted last minute. Diverting is her signature tactic. She once said, if you want to save love from institutional stampedes, don't whisper about betrayal on phone calls. Save it for ink. Ink is the only currency monarchy archives can't fully control after the key holders die. Day -7. She spent 2 hours writing. This is the estimated window for the letter to William. She did not finalize it at once. She agonized through punctuation like a chess clock. She sealed the envelope 3 to 7 weeks before her death. But timing window builds mysterious ink pattern that the palace didn't want unified between sons. Day -6 to -2. Normal interactions. Hotel lunches. Banter. Shopping. Dresses angled for cameras. But at night, handwriting angled for consequence. September -1, 1997, one day before official crash timeline. Diana leaves an envelope for William, none witnessed by procedural staff. That means a lot now because it likely contained evidence of inside threat awareness. If it was just love mail, it would have been logged and stamped. But it cries emergency to be read later, not emergency to be read now. Emergency freedom is one thing. Emergency truth timing is another. Have you considered that tragic announcements often have footnotes and subtext calendars? William thought ink didn't outrank memory. But memory doesn't have precedence clauses. Ink does, which is why the palace didn't want that ink delivered at 15 or 35. They needed 43-year emotional audit jurisdiction instead. Think about this paradox long enough, because this chapter also shackles you into audience questions directly. If grief cadence is procedure, suspicion cadence is audit stream. Which cadence lasts longest if unassigned? Silence. The palace inhaled tunnel noise, but swallowed consequence timing log. William would later inherit the log's absence at 35 and the letter's presence at 43. Why 43? Because emotional audit focus peaks are fatherhood-referenced alignment years. Because fatherhood changes what you tolerate about institutions, what you interrogate about procedure, how you interpret whiteness silence. Diana didn't write this letter in fear of dying. She wrote it in fear it would be opened by sons too young to audit the system she believed endangered them. That night splinter wasn't a crash. It was a category breach. No log. Just consequence. Cream envelope. No quartet. Just maternal punctuation. And a man upstairs unaware that maternal handwriting would someday indict architecture instead of memory. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This phase of the story begins with a question most people never think to ask. Who keeps the grief of kings? Who files the mythology behind the monarchy? And more importantly, who watches over the letters that could destroy the version of history the world was handed? Let me reframe this in the first 10 seconds of the chapter so you feel the chill immediately. What if the gatekeeper was never guarding the crown, but guarding the mirror reflecting it? William, now 43, didn't inherit a throne yet, but he inherited questions no heir was ever trained to ask. Where do envelopes go when mothers outrank media, but media outranks sons? Who owns basements humbler than crowns, but more jurisdictional than interviews? And why do archivists retire faster than conspiracy timelines degrade? This story needs a face. Not a royal face, an archive face. Enter Lady Seraphina Markham. Not famous, not controversial, not interviewed, not corroborated by camera flash. She lived between keys and corridors. Lady Markham was Diana's former archival liaison at Kensington Palace, entrusted with legacy-sensitive correspondence, letters that held emotional consequence but didn't count as state treason. In royal infrastructure, that category is more charged than the crimes journalists love, because destabilizing an heir's emotional cadence can collapse monarchy optics, contracts, succession expectations, public allegiance, published stoicism, cultural pageantry, brotherly divergence arcs, and documentary-friendly grief timelines. She wasn't beloved by the public because the public never knew her role. Archivists don't attend funerals. They attend consequences. Picture a woman who had access to every drawer, every uncatalogued footnote, every envelope that fell between ceremony and grief triage. Her job wasn't romance. It was risk labyrinth containment. Royal administrative architecture and narrative continuity fear unauthorized identity assaults more from personal correspondence than governmental breaches. Let's zoom back to 1997. The palace PR machine had crowned Diana a humanitarian saint and media victim in public memory. And that narrative has been defended by optics for 25 years. But someone defended it first in index systems instead of public rebuttals. That someone was Lady Markham. You're asking, was she loyal to Diana? No, she was loyal to alignment. Alignment protects the institution, not the individual. Another paradox. The person holding legacy keys does not hold sentiment keys. So sentiment becomes shadow jurisdiction, but never loggable. Here's a fact that makes this chapter toenail-scratching tense. Royal archives don't separate personal grief letters from succession-impacting ones by emotion. They separate them by delivery timing windows. If delivered too early, they collapse heir stability optics. If delivered too late, they collapse public mythology optics. So the safest place is midlife span unlogged staging. Lady Markham handled envelopes that shaped heirs quietly. She once said in an internal archive orientation lecture, "A crown is worn by the head. A narrative is worn by its architecture." That tells you everything about motivation without giving you motive in a log. She believed, if an envelope could change succession optics, it must wait until succession optics change on their own. But succession optics can't self-schedule grief at tunnels. They do it in back wingtips. This chapter has a villain most people always suspected at age 35 interviews. Press intrusion, government leaks, romantic messy alliances, brotherly divergence, freedom-coded decisioning. But the real villain was not freedom. It was jurisdiction over freedom's timestamps. Markham's job was to track threats to image continuity through courier oversight designation panels. These are panels reserved for transition-sensitive correspondence that can emotionally destabilize an heir pre-inauguration or pre-audit ages. So here's a question for you watching right now. Have you ever noticed that the most powerful people in a monarchy don't hold crowns? They hold clearance over consequence readability. Markham once trained archive aides in optics-first routing. Optics-first routing means you file destabilizing heir letters not by destruction, but by timing exile. That is precisely how a letter can still be cream, pristine, sealed, and mother-written without having entered a log. Diana believed documents should travel through human eyes that loved truth, not human eyes that loved continuity. She once joked to William by phone in the final years, "One day you'll inherit the keys older than your father's patience for procedure, and then you'll understand the room's smiles can't annotate." Funny when you're 17. But ominous when you finally read the architecture. Markham was guarding more than envelopes that night. She was guarding sequencing itself. which makes her the keeper of the music, not the motive. Music without quartet equals no loggable accountability. Diana did not want her sons pacified by a staged narrative. She wanted them sharpened by unscheduled human truth later, not procedure-controlled insight earlier. But unscheduled truth violates procedure, which violates institution optics, which violates stability arcs, which violates organized delivery timing windows. So the palace chose to exile the letter from Windows. Markham routed envelopes to unclassified personal correspondence, air-restricted panels that night. When a panel carries air-restricted, it means the heir may one day read it, but not before the institution reads it first emotionally and decides if it can be sequenced in a stable audit stream or unstable scandal stream. She read the letter early, maybe, but William read it late, definitely. Timelines don't expire. People with keys do. Because once you have narrative jurisdiction over drawers, you inherit the ability to hide omissions as decorum instead of disappearance. Markham handled everything meticulously, with a kind of eerie politeness. Procedure polish. Gloves that could smother ink perception. The whisper logic. If you want to record subtext, bury it inside curated noise perception cycles, but never inside loggable windows assigned to heirs emotionally untrained or auditally unappointed. You're wondering now, did she know the contents? Yes, but contents weren't the risk. Delivery was. Delivery at the wrong age can collapse heirs or institutions. Collapse heirs at 15 equals succession crisis. Collapse institutions at 35 equals public narrative coup. Collapse both equals irresponsible timing. So she prevented collapse by denying its quartet existence. If you ever wondered how no one logged a Diana letter, consider this. She didn't delete it from the drawer. She deleted the drawer from succession audit windows. And windows are more powerful than drawers if you want silence to last. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. 3 questions in the dark. Who writes the truth? Who hides it? And who eventually inherits the burn it starts? William thought ink didn't carry temperature. Diana knew ink carried eternity. But eternity needs a window to explode through, doesn't it? And whose window was she writing for? His heart, his crown, or the collision between them? Let's move into the 5-week corridor before the world collapsed on August 31st, 1997. The tragic images would later be remembered by everyone. But no one remembered the quiet procurement from Paris that mattered earlier. If a letter is a timed blueprint, then the most important day isn't the day it's read. It's the day it refuses to disappear. Diana wrote to William constantly during his youth, silly birthday cards, private marginalia, affectionate mother warfare jokes. But her final message wasn't marginalia. It was architecture. It was consequence. It was love as scaffolding. She didn't say, "Here is the danger." She said, "Here is the permanence protecting you from it one day." A friend close to her later told a historian that she often said, "A mother protects with hugs when she can. When she can't, she protects with delayed truth." Delayed truth isn't denial. It's inheritance insurance. Think about this right now, watching. Do you prepare a king by calming him, or by sharpening him later when calm stops helping? The letter Diana sealed for William was routed through institutional procedure without entering procedural memory logs. That means one thing. Someone assessed the impact as heritage-level seismic, but loyalty-level heretical. Not because it could destabilize England, but because it could destabilize the image of England's heirs. Image destabilization always outranks tunnel noise if the institution is at stake. Diana knew this paradox intimately because she lived inside it. She said publicly, "I want my sons to live free." But she said privately in code diaries, "Freedom has no jurisdiction without evidence later." Evidence is permission to collapse mirrors. Here's the constant pacing contradiction William later admitted. "I always believed the palace protected me from instability. I never imagined it protected the instability from me." This wasn't nostalgia. This was tectonic inheritance. If the letter had been read at age 15, tragedy erupts younger than monarchy can sustain. If read at age 35, institution collapses older than grief can soften. If read at 43, suspicion peaks, grief reframes, fatherhood audits procedure, kingship understanding is emotionally appointed and narrative armed. William was ready at 43 because 43 is the age you tolerate rewriting basements more than headlines. Diana factored this exactly 5 to 7 weeks before the crash. She referenced her son's ages in emotional cadence patterns instead of timestamps, i.e., when you're twice a father, or when crown logistics feel heavier than corridors. She believed the letter would be safer placed outside logs for decades than inside logs imminently going through audit stream she feared could unify suspicion between sons prematurely. Diana didn't write a goodbye. She wrote a lens. Most of you watching probably think of Diana's letters romantically. This one wasn't romance filed. It was consequence filed as a key to rooms William wasn't meant to open until maturity peaked. Diana believed maturity peaks shouldn't be calendar assigned. They should destabilize calendar custodianship itself. Now imagine being 17-year-old William without knowing this letter existed. Your mother calls you by phone, laughing with inside jokes, calming your teenage grief storms. She avoids heavy topics, not because there were none, but because she was sequencing grief divergence versus suspicion audit later. You hang up thinking everything is emotionally archived in your heart because a mother's voice doesn't need paper. But paper stores what voice cannot soften when it's last. Now consider the architecture of what this letter carried without disclosing contents yet, because retention thrives on consequences, not specifics too early. It reframed Diana's final weeks not as chaos, but calibration. It reframed the brothers not as divergent grief arcs, but mistimed suspicion arcs. It reframed monarchy whispers not as accidental silence, but inside threat mitigation planning. Inside threat mitigation is the deepest category a monarchy has that isn't treason, but feels like treason emotionally if read by heirs young. Diana once told a close aide at a café on Rue Cambon in Paris, William is insulated by continuity. Harry is exposed to contradiction. But one day, both will inherit perspective. And then archives won't save institutions. Heirs will audit them. Funny how that lands now. Perspective is power long after noise ends. When Diana sealed the envelope, she did it ceremonially alone at night. No quartet, no witness, no log, just mother plus consequence. Most people misunderstand confidentiality in monarchies. It isn't practiced to hide truths forever. It is practiced to delay the age that can weaponize them. William now confirms. The ink was unmistakably hers. But this isn't a story about unmistakable ink. It's a story about unmistakable disappearance from logs. Because logs determine accountability, and accountability determines myth collapse, not sons' hearts. At age 35, William would pass through official archive audit cycles, but find no mention of heritage-impacting personal heir correspondence from Paris that might emotionally destabilize the future if read too early. That omission ensured silence longer than investigative noise could sustain itself publicly. Diana believed cameras chase tragedies, but archivists file impact potentialities thereafter. She wrote accordingly. So if someone hid the letter, consider this question now. Was the hiding protective or political? Protecting the heirs is non-political, always logged. Protecting the system from heirs equals political, never logged. This is exactly why William now reframes the reveal tone emotionally instead of administratively, because emotional relevance can collapse access, but never loggable accountability at wrong age. William didn't inherit fear at 17. He inherited locks he would learn to question at 43. Let me give you 3 emotional spikes that happened next, still weeks before the crash, that build retention scaffolding without giving away the final payoff. Spike 1. Diana misdirected fear into banter. A French friend later said she joked constantly about press intrusion and dating life to bury intention behind predictable glamour noise. Glamour noise is anesthesia for dangerous succession log pipeline glitchettes. Spike 2. Diana recontextualized grief prevention as kingship empowerment. She wanted William to one day read the letter during fatherhood or kingship appointment alignment years, because fatherhood questions mirrors more than roles do. Spike 3. The silence seeded misreading. William believed for decades no document from those final weeks outranked emotional memory. But emotional memory changes before evidence appears ages later. The envelope once excluded from logs in 1997 survived the longest because it bore emotional insurance not by tagging, but by withholding tag. Withholding tag invites no public audit cadence until keys expire or heirs mature. She filed by consequence, not chronology. Time is not the villain. Window of readability is. Diana's letter was stored not by deletion, but by timed resurfacing proximity logic. The safest place to bury heir-impacting personal consequence letters is between procedure drawers none interrogate mid-grief and release windows none assign until maturity spikes do it for you. Most people think William found the letter recently. No, he found the room that refused to log it first. And one day, he would inherit the keys earlier than the crown was ready to withstand. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Grief is supposed to bond families. So why did it split one? That's the mini-hook that slams open this chapter. You remember the British monarchy in mourning, the sea of flowers, the bowed heads, the boys walking behind the coffin like commas trailing a sentence the world wrote for them. But here's the twist you didn't realize at the time. The fissure didn't originate with Netflix interviews or spare bedroom memoirs or tabloids stoking brotherly heat years later. The rift originated in a filing decision that happened long before they could spell constitutional vocabulary. Diana didn't just leave two sons behind. She left two unfolding interpretations of silence. William, molded in ceremony, believed silence equals dignity. Harry, scorched by contradiction early, believed silence equals exile. Two boys, same grief, different grammar for silence. Do you ever ask why one brother narrates loudly and the other rules quietly? Maybe it started not in contrast of personality, but contrast of access classification logic assessed without their consent. Access makes suspects out of categories. When William looks back now, he remembers instinct without index potential. Harry remembers index potential without instinct calibration. You don't often get both. When you do, narratives get rewired, scandals get exfoliated, succession gets queasy, mirrors tremble, and courtesy-level silence can outlive press-driven noise for decades. Now, let's zoom through the emotional architecture of their divergence. William's grief was ceremonially inoculated. The palace did that deliberately. You prepare heirs for crowns by teaching them continuity first, introspection second, outrage never. Outrage destabilizes symmetry. Symmetry is the oxygen monarchy breathes. You log letters into procedure, but you don't log destabilization into heirs. Not at 15. Harry's grief was left exposed to contradiction. You remember him being restless, emotional, unfiltered. Titles don't love that grammar. Diaries do. And diaries, unlike red boxes, don't require witness signatures. That means his arc was emotional sovereignty first, administrative sovereignty last. Public mythology conscripted Harry into a breakaway narrative. But what if the story always mattered more than the breakaway? You don't know the pulse of heartbreak like a queen knows scheduling windows, preserving optics. But Diana once said, the palace will want sons predictable in grief. But grief, by definition, is unsupervised. Unsupervised grief is the one thing you can't put on a crown timetable. William supervised his grief for decades. Harry unsupervised his. That difference was always monetizable by media, but not by archives. Audience question for you. Do you think silence survives longer when emotionally supervised or administratively supervised? Answer: administratively. Because administration forgives omission. Emotion does not. Now to the contradictions you didn't catch at 17, 25, 35, or even 40. Contradiction 1. Diana hated royal restraint, but leveraged royal privilege like encryption. Contradiction 2. William honored crown continuity, but never interrogated crown archival continuity until now. Contradiction 3. Harry threatened crown continuity publicly, but preserved Diana continuity privately through anecdote floodgates. Which brother's method indicted the institution first? Neither. The institution indicted itself by never logging Diana's consequence envelope that night. You don't often indict institutions with diary leaks. You indict them with missing diaries. Or missing letters. Because missing letters pose questions that fathers don't outgrow. Now let's talk about archive keys. Markham handled everything because keys belong not to mourners, but to mirroring symmetry holders. Public myth said Diana plus paparazzi versus Diana plus crown versus Diana plus romance. Nobody said Diana plus unlogged correspondence. which implies someone who loved alignment more than signage held jurisdiction that night. The brothers would grow into different lanes of Britain's storytelling motorcade. One tracked stability, one tracked contradiction, but neither tracked archival exile indexing that night. So if you wondered who was most powerful that evening, consider this. Power is the ability to silence timestamps more than headlines. Another twist that hits like cold velvet. Asia, the palace's protection instinct, declines when grief equals ceremony. Ceremony has clear attendance and departure windows. Protection panels normally have four-part accountability: writer, courier, witness, log. This envelope left log because it entered consequence designation by someone loyal to symmetry over Diana sentiments. Symmetry is protection for monarchy, not sons. So Diana sentiments were withheld as architecture-level threat metadata, but not because it destabilized the UK government.